Good morning. I'd like you to recall about 4 years ago when the world was faced with what was thought of as an impossibility. COVID-19 and quarantine changed the way we do things in many industries, but perhaps most memorable was doing work and schooling online. The National Institute of Health reported 71% of students had heightened stress and anxiety during this period of time. This situation rattled the schooling system. 8 months ago, the free application for federal student aid, or FAFSA, was announced that it would be updated. The new FAFSA released in December, with numerous bugs and after many delays. Millions of students struggled to apply for financial aid, and many are still waiting. Those attempting to enroll in college, graduate school, or any post-secondary education are being faced with obstacle after obstacle. You would be hard-pressed to find any student completely satisfied with their FAFSA experience. This situation rattled the schooling system yet again. Granted, this situation is not the case for every student. Many students will experience a school career with little to no national or international interference. However, this does not mean that high stress levels are exclusive to students who dealt and are dealing with these issues. The United States of America is not only the country with the most stressed students worldwide, but also consistently ranks in the top 10 for adolescent suicide. The American Psychological Association reports that over a third of high school students feel completely overwhelmed, and 80% of students feel academic and school-related stress. In a survey conducted for this school, only one student felt confident in their ability to manage stress. Many students expressed frustration with workload, scheduling, and grades, and one student even expressed a frustration with life itself. The fact is that this feeling of high stress and serious frustration is not unique at any school. The problem is across the board at almost every academic institution. So the question is, how did we get here? Schooling is not a new concept by any means, dating back to the times of Aristotle, but in the United States, schooling began in the one-room schoolhouse, where all ages were grouped together and taught by one teacher. By 1929, attending school was mandatory in every state. Not long after the introduction of schooling, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, or SAT, was introduced. A myriad of standardized tests followed suit, with well over 50 existing today. In 2001, these tests were federally recognized and became a requirement for public schools to secure funding. Today, the average public school student will take 112 standardized tests by the end of their schooling career. Very early on, scientists began research about the mental strain on students. Research on testing anxiety, sleep deprivation, and academic stress began as early as 1952. By the 1980s, the very nuances of anxiety were being recognized and defined. Many organizations still dedicate themselves to researching and learning about the mental effects of school, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Psychological Association, and the Center for Disease Control. The importance of addressing the teenage mental health crisis is real. Given the amount of interest in school stress levels, it's natural to wonder what sort of responsibilities a school would have regarding this stress. And while the idea that schools are doing fine as is and do not need to take responsibility may be appealing to some, it is of increasing importance that schools do indeed make some sort of change. Academic institutions need to take the initiative to combat the stress of their student population. This is evident as not only do schools play a large role in creating stress, but schools do not offer enough support currently. Schools need to step up because students definitely feel academic pressure and stress. Research proves that schools and their systems can cause stress, and there is not enough support for students. It must first be said that student stress is increasing. Thomas Curran of the American Psychological Association stated that students have higher expectations of themselves and others than in other generations, and that today's young people feel that perfectionism is necessary in order to feel safe, socially connected, and of worth. The Newport Academy reported at least 25% of students suffer from maladaptive perfectionism, a condition defined as striving for unrealistic perfection to the point of causing physical pain. This mass anxiety plaguing the student population isn't surprising either. The way schools are set up, one would think they're designed that way. Take, for instance, the system of testing. It is estimated that 40 to 60% of students get anxiety as it relates to testing. This has been researched since 1952, and yet the way the US has administered these tests remains largely the same. One could also look at homework levels. The recommended time spent on homework is the grade level times 10. For example, it is recommended that a 5th grade student spend 50 minutes on homework and a 10th grade student spend 100 minutes on homework. However, some research shows that students spend up to 3 hours on homework, far above the recommended time even for seniors. Stanford University concluded that 56% of students view homework as a primary source of stress. It's also worth examining school start times. To quote a European scientist specializing in educational psychology named Louis M. Terman, the European custom of beginning school at 7 to 8 o'clock in the morning works great hardship, often causing the people to rush away to school in nervous haste and without breakfast. The American practice of beginning school at 9 o'clock is far wiser and should not be changed unless for very special reasons. This is obviously not the case anymore, and as such, some sources such as Better Health Channel state that currently teens are only sleeping 6.5 to 7.5 hours a night. The Center for Disease Control has recommended a start time of 8:30 a.m. at the earliest, and yet 93% of high schools start before this time, some a full hour before. Often, schools do not have enough support for the struggles their students face either. The national average for student to school counselor ratio is 408 to 1. A grand total of 13% of schools strongly agree that their facility effectively provides mental health support. The JED Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to assisting teen mental health, said, "Students' mental health needs were significant and were not being fully addressed in high schools. Students reported anxiety as a top problem, and students felt their peers did not know how to cope with stress, where to seek help for mental health issues, or even the signs of suicidal ideation." This conclusion was drawn before the pandemic, and there's a colossal amount of research showing that COVID-19 only intensified the existing adolescent mental health crisis. If schools were already behind in student mental health assistance before, it is now more imperative that schools begin implementing strategies for minimizing student stress. Yet, one might still argue that schools should not need to take initiative to combat the stress levels of their student body. They could believe academic pressure comes from caretakers, circumstances, or social media. It's common to assume that external sources are to blame for much adolescent stress, and this can be proved. This argument, however, does not exempt schools from responsibility. It can be said that a problem is caused by multiple factors, and attempting to deal with one factor does not mean that the others do not exist. It may also be said that students have a personal responsibility to their own feelings, anxieties, and stresses. However, 2 Corinthians 1:4b says, "We can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God." God never says to make people deal with their own problem. The Bible actively supports the opposite. We aren't just supposed to leave people without help, and if a school can do something to help their students, it should. Ultimately, it is up to schools to make a decision that is best for their students. There is most certainly more than one solution to addressing student stress, and the solution may not be the same for every student. Even still, schools need to address these issues. To quote a local educator, we need to recognize our students. The truth of the matter is that the youth of today report the most mental illness of any generation, so decidedly that you have to genuinely scour to find a source that says otherwise. The impact schools are choosing not to make is explicit and tangible. Schools need to take initiative to combat student stress because students definitely feel academic pressure and stress. Research proves that schools and their systems can cause stress, and there is not enough support for students in schools currently. When schools opt out of caring for their students, there is not a party involved that does not suffer for it. Refraining from action will only exacerbate the problem. Academic institutions need to take the initiative to alleviate the stress of their student population. Our future generation depends on it. Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you.
Good job. You got through it. I definitely understand stress in school because I was one of the people that had that. So I definitely get that. As you were talking, I started thinking of certain career fields such as cardiologists, surgeons, engineers. As you talked about perfectionism, those fields actually require people to be pretty perfect, unless things will just kind of go awry. So how do you respond to people that say we actually need, in our field, we actually need an appropriate amount of stress and perfectionism to actually make this field work, or to properly equip this person to proceed in this field?
Of course, it's a very good question. I would say that you choose to be one of those things. You do not choose to be a high school student. That is required by law. A surgeon is choosing that career path, and yes, of course, there's a very high stress career path. However, it's important to remember that that is a thing that student has chosen for themselves, and of course, it's imperative that they do well in their work. Lives depend on it. However, that is the work that they chose to do, and alleviating stress in a field where perfection is necessary is not necessary. However, alleviating stress in a field where perfectionism is not necessary is necessary. Does that make sense?
You did a great job. I used to be a science teacher, and I know that stress causes growth. That without stress, trees and other animals will not gain the structure, the resilience that they need to handle the different things that we thrown at them. So how does this apply to what you have kind of proposed as well? You made a clear and good case, and I completely agree with it, but how do we know maybe the difference between good stress and bad stress, or how do we define what is stress that's causing growth versus stress that is causing maybe a harm?
Thank you for your question. I think one really easy way to gauge how healthy an amount of stress is how students respond to it. It is not unlikely that students will complain about any amount of stress. That is, it's part of being a kid. However, I don't think what we're seeing is a healthy level of stress. As stated earlier in Amelia's presentation, 1/3 of adolescents have a plan to commit suicide, and an amount of stress and hopelessness that is so large that people are willing to end any potential career, life, family dream that they might have ever had over it cannot be called healthy stress.
Very true, yes.
Very,
Very good. Yes.
Focusing on the topic of providing those services within schools, providing mental health services, counseling, things like that to help alleviate some of the stress. What do you suggest to schools that are faced with the challenge of there are no counselors available, or they do not receive state or federal funding to cover the cost of a counselor full-time?
This is a very interesting question. I will say it reminds me of some research I did on school funding. A lot of schools were able to implement new mental health processes in their schools with money provided by COVID alleviation. However, that is getting cut off soon. I think a good countermeasure is to increase the government budget on public schools. A lot of people attending private schools like this one may not see the need for it, but people who aren't fortunate enough to attend a private school still need that funding.
As we heard also in other presentations, stress and anxiety can come from societal, parental areas as well. What would you suggest ways forward, saying students may not necessarily feel the stress in the school, but how do we prevent them from feeling that stress, or how do we handle the stress when they bring the stress into the environment of the school?
Thank you for your question. I think I'm going to answer with a thing that Logos does. So Logos Academy has an academic counselor for academic guidance, but they also have an emotional counselor that can handle that. I know students personally who have seen and met with this emotional counselor, and it has helped them deal with stress at home, even if they're not feeling that in school. So having different types of counselors with different expertise would help. I think also it would be good, many colleges provide free counseling if high schools had the funding to offer the same. Does that answer your question?
So I know really, I like how you started about mentioning COVID, and I know really well what you went through during your year of COVID. And there's nothing that I can do about that. There's nothing I can do about everything you went through. I can't do anything about the murder of George Floyd. I can't do anything about the current things that we have with Israel, Palestine, all these different factors that are going on that are far bigger than Mr. Hortman, for example, right? So what would you, and that's just true for all of us in this room, so what do you recommend when students are dealing with high levels of stress caused by failures of systems that are out of their control? What are you recommending? Because we all at some point have to just deal with it on a very personal level.
I think therapy is always a good option. Schools offering in-school therapy would help with that. Maybe not necessarily offering a solution, but offering a space to be open with how a student feels about the failure of the system. I think it would obviously be helpful to have therapy, but it also might be helpful to address things. A lot of schools would just prefer to keep quiet and not address problems, but being open about when our local or national systems have not done their job correctly is opening a space for learning to happen, which is what schools are for.
When you were talking about test anxiety and standardized testing, obviously there is a need for the testing in many aspects to track student growth and to evaluate our own systems, but I also know that they do cause a lot of stress for our students. How can we better the testing system to meet the needs of those stressors?
Thank you for your question. It's a very good question. I would say it would help to take a look at the last time these tests have been updated. Some of these tests have not been updated since the 90s.
That is true.
So it might be good to look at the relevance of the questions in today's world, adapt questions to better fit how students learn today. I am not an educator or an examiner, so I cannot say for sure like a specific change. However, if a group of people who have taken these tests and are educated in education were to form a committee and to take a practical look at how these exams function, that may be able to help. I also think it might be helpful because I know in public school, when I was in public school, there was a lot of pressure to do well on the PSSAs because that is how our elementary school got its funding. I feel like there should be more than one avenue to determine a school's success and how much funding it gets than the performance of students on one exam. I feel like that could alleviate some of the pressure on performing well on that exam.
Final question. You talked about the effects that COVID had on students, heightened anxiety and stress, and there are a lot of people that say technology is the reason why all of these things persisting, social media and all of that as well. But we also know that technology is not going away, we're actually diving into it. So what role do you think technology plays in helping students to relieve the stress in school?
I think, that's a very good question. I think schools tend to shy away from technology. There are many, like no phones in class, limited access to the internet when there is access. I would say if the school was willing to create an online platform for, say, scheduling an appointment with the academic or emotional guidance counselor, if a school had a portal to make complaints or address certain problems.
That's a good idea.
Many schools, this school does have an app, but many schools do not. And many schools don't have the online resources for students. It may also be helpful to just use the internet and connect students with things online that can help them, such as online therapy treatments or affordable options when it comes to offline therapy treatments, books and websites and things where a student can do research on the things that are troubling them and how to handle it.